"Where is the money, Garrett?" I asked at Christmas dinner, watching my son's hands tremble against the white tablecloth. He mumbled something about investments and timing, but I wasn't asking because I didn't know. I was asking because 3 hidden cameras in his studio had already told me everything, including the moment he sold his dead mother's Stradivarius for gambling money. Tonight wasn't a dinner. It was a concert, and I was about to play the final movement. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this story. Before we continue, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from. Also, tell me, how would you react in that situation? This is a fictional story, dramatized for storytelling, but it carries meaningful and insightful themes. The turkey sat golden and glistening beneath the crystal chandelier of my son's dining room in Bryn Mawr, a picture of affluence so perfectly staged it could have been a magazine spread. But to me, it tasted like ash and unpaid hospital invoices. I sat there, Edmund Hargrove, 72 years old, and a retired conductor who once led the Philadelphia Orchestra through Mahler's Second Symphony, The Resurrection, now trying to orchestrate my own survival in the suffocating silence of my son's fraudulent prosperity. The dining room was a monument to excess. Abstract paintings hung on walls that had been replastered just weeks ago, their frames catching the warm amber light like gilt cages. The furniture was new Italian leather chairs that still smelled of the showroom, a mahogany table so polished I could see the distorted reflection of my own gaunt face staring back at me. Everything in this house screamed money that wasn't earned. It whispered of theft, dressed in silk. My son, Garrett Hargrove, 39 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and a nervous energy that vibrated through his fingers like a badly tuned string, sat at the head of the table. He was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than a month of his supposed income from the music production studio he claimed was thriving. Beside him sat Meredith Hargrove, 35, a lifestyle blogger whose phone screen glowed with notifications she checked every 40 seconds, and whose laughter never quite harmonized with the conversation around her. I sipped the Bordeaux, a 2019 Chateau Margaux. I knew the price because I had seen the charge on the joint emergency account I had foolishly left accessible to my son. $700 for a single bottle, poured while my surgical deposit sat unpaid in a hospital billing system 3 miles away. You see, when you have spent 30 years standing before an orchestra of 100 musicians, you develop a particular sensitivity to dissonance. A single oboe playing a quarter tone flat, a timpani entering half a beat early, the almost imperceptible hesitation of a violinist who hasn't practiced. My son was a symphony of wrong notes, and I had been listening to the dissonance for 8 weeks. I hadn't come for the turkey or the wine. I had come because every hidden microphone I planted in his studio, every frame of surveillance footage I reviewed in the blue-dark silence of my apartment, had confirmed what my ears already suspected, that the man sitting across from me had sold my survival for the rush of a bet, and pawned his mother's legacy for the price of pixels on a screen. Garrett reached for the wine decanter, his fingers trembling as the crystal clinked against his glass. He was talking about a new artist collaboration, something about streaming royalties and vertical integration. The words were hollow, the musical equivalent of playing scales when the audience expects a concerto. Meredith interrupted every few minutes to share engagement metrics on her latest post, completely oblivious to the way Garrett's eyes darted toward me every time I set down my fork with deliberate precision. I let the performance continue for 23 minutes. I counted. A conductor always counts. Then I set my fork down. The silver striking the porcelain rang through the room like the opening note of a requiem. The warm air crystallized. The Christmas lights on the mantelpiece seemed to dim, as if the very house knew what was coming. "Garrett," I said, keeping my voice as steady as a metronome set to adagio, "did the hospital send the confirmation for the December 1st payment?" The room went still. Meredith's thumb froze mid-scroll. I watched the color drain from my son's face, his skin turning the shade of a blank page, empty, terrified, and waiting to be written upon by someone else's hand. "The medical fund I set up for you to manage," I continued, my eyes locked on his. The $295,000 I transferred for the surgery. You cleared the balance by the deadline, correct? Garrett's mouth opened and closed. A silent instrument trying to produce a sound it no longer knew how to make. He looked at Meredith. She didn't look back. Her fingers had curled around the stem of her wine glass so tightly that I expected the crystal to crack. "Dad, it's Christmas Eve," he finally whispered. Can we talk about this after dinner?" "No," I said. "We cannot." I reached into the leather satchel beside my chair. I did not pull out a gift or a card. I pulled out a laptop and placed it directly on the table. The gravy boat shoved aside without ceremony. The screen glowed a cold, surgical blue. "Since your memory seems to be failing you, Garrett, I brought some visual aids. I think you will recognize the location. I certainly hope you recognize the performer." I pressed a key. The night vision footage from his studio filled the screen, and there was my son, captured in grainy green clarity, pulling his dead mother's manuscripts from a drawer and shoving them into a duffel bag at 2 in the morning. Garrett's chair scraped backward. His face was a mask of pure, distilled terror. But I wasn't finished. I was only at the overture. And the crescendo, the moment that would break him completely, was still waiting in the next room, hidden inside a 300-year-old instrument he believed no longer existed. Let me take you back to where this symphony began. 8 weeks ago, a doctor told me I was going blind, and the first person I trusted with my survival was the one who sold my eyes for a poker chip. There is a particular silence in a doctor's office that sounds different from any other silence in the world. It is not the comfortable quiet of a concert hall before the downbeat, nor the reverent hush of an audience holding its breath between movements. It is a clinical silence, sterile, measured, and loaded with the weight of words that have not yet been spoken, but are already reshaping the architecture of your life. I sat in Dr. Sonia Khatri's consultation room at Penn Medicine on a Tuesday morning in early October, watching the autumn light filter through vertical blinds and cast thin golden bars across the floor. The room smelled of antiseptic and printer toner, a combination so far removed from the rosin and aged wood of my former life that it felt like sitting inside a machine designed to process human beings into statistics. I had driven myself there after 3 weeks of ignoring what my body was telling me. The first sign had been subtle, a slight dimming at the periphery of my left eye, as if someone were slowly pulling a curtain closed from the edge of my vision. I told myself it was fatigue. I told myself that 72-year-old eyes simply wore down like the felt on piano hammers. But when I sat at my desk one morning, attempting to read a Brahms score, and found the staff lines dissolving at the margins like ink bleeding into water, I knew this was not the natural dimming of age. This was something structural, something failing. Dr. Khatri entered with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon who had delivered devastating news so many times that compassion had become a practiced rather than spontaneous response. She was a small woman with sharp dark eyes and a posture that suggested absolute confidence in her own expertise. She did not waste time on pleasantries. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and opened my file with the precision of a musician opening a score. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice flat and clinical. "The MRI confirms what we suspected. You have a meningioma, a benign tumor pressing directly against your optic nerve. Specifically, it is compressing the chiasm, which is where the nerve fibers from both eyes cross." She turned her monitor to face me, and I saw the scan, a gray mass, the size of a walnut, sitting like... It looked almost peaceful in its stillness, a silent saboteur content to squeeze the light out of my world 1 millimeter at a time. In my world, Mr. Hargrove, this is what we call a ticking clock without a visible face. You can't see the countdown, but the mechanism is running. If we do not operate within 10 weeks, the optic nerve will sustain permanent damage. The compression is already at a critical threshold. Beyond that window, the structural integrity of the nerve will be irreversible. You will lose your sight. Completely. Permanently. I processed her words with the same detachment I once used to read a tempo marking on a score, allegro con fuoco. Fast, with fire. That was the speed at which my world was about to collapse. "The surgery," she continued, pulling up a cost breakdown on her screen, craniotomy with microsurgical resection. We are looking at $295,000. Total the surgical team, the anesthesiology, the specialized neuro-ophthalmology monitoring, and a minimum of 3 weeks inpatient recovery. $295,000. I calculated the figure against my remaining assets, the proceeds from selling our home in Chestnut Hill after Vivian passed, my pension from the orchestra, and the modest investments I had accumulated over 3 decades of conducting. It was nearly everything I had left. The final movement of my financial life, written in a key I had never expected to play. My mind drifted to Vivian then, the way it always did when the world became too clinical and too cold. Vivian Hargrove, née Alessi, the woman who sat in the first chair of the cello section the night I conducted my debut with the Philadelphia Orchestra. She was 26, with dark curling hair and hands that moved across the strings as if they were having a private conversation with God. I fell in love with her before the first movement ended. We married 14 months later. She died 2 years ago. Heart failure, the cruel irony of a woman whose heart was larger than anyone I ever knew, simply running out of rhythm. We had spent everything we had on her treatments, emptying our accounts to buy her 6 more months of hearing the birds outside our bedroom window. I did not regret a single dollar of it, but it left this surgery fund as my last shield against the dark. Is a man's sight worth $295,000? I asked, more to myself than to her. It is worth whatever you have left, Mr. Hargrove, Dr. Khatri replied. Because without it, you will never read another score. You will never see another sunrise. You will exist in permanent night. I looked at the clinical white walls, at the scan of the tumor sitting so calmly against the nerve that connected me to everything beautiful in the world, and I made a decision. I would transfer the money to Garrett, not because I was foolish, but because I wanted to believe, needed to believe that the boy who once fell asleep in my arms while I hummed Debussy's Clair de Lune still existed somewhere inside the man he had become. I wanted to test his character without the pressure of guilt or obligation. I would not tell him the money was for surgery. I would tell him it was for legacy planning, and I would watch, the way a conductor watches his orchestra, to see if the integrity of the instrument matched the beauty of its sound. I walked out of Penn Medicine with a diagnosis folded in my breast pocket and a countdown ticking behind my eyes. The autumn air hit my face, cool and bright, and I stood on the hospital steps looking at the Philadelphia skyline with a terrifying new awareness that every building, every tree, every face I passed could be the last thing I ever saw clearly. The world looked painfully vivid, as if it knew I was about to lose it and was showing off one final time. I decided to hand my son the keys to my survival. I wanted to believe that music runs in blood, that the boy who once fell asleep to his mother's cello would guard the melody of my life with the same tenderness she once used to tune her strings. I was catastrophically wrong. My son arrived at my apartment, smelling of expensive cologne and desperation in equal measure. It was a Thursday evening, 4 days after the diagnosis, and the autumn light had already bled out of the sky, leaving the windows of my Rittenhouse Square apartment, reflecting only the amber glow of the desk lamp and the ghostly blue of my laptop screen. I had spent the afternoon arranging the apartment with the meticulous care of a stage manager before opening night, every surface cleared of medical paperwork, every pamphlet from Penn Medicine shredded and buried at the bottom of the recycling bin. Garrett stepped through the door at 6:15, precisely on time, which was itself an anomaly. My son had not been punctual since his junior recital at Curtis. When he was 17, a performance of Prokofiev that his mother described with diplomatic gentleness as enthusiastic but undisciplined. Tonight, however, he arrived with the eager punctuality of a man who smells opportunity. He was wearing a new suit charcoal with a subtle pinstripe, tailored close at the waist in a way that suggested a fitting within the last week. I recognized quality fabric the way I recognized a well-rosined bow by the way it moved. "Dad, sorry if I'm a few minutes early," he said, though he was not sorry at all. His eyes scanned the room with a quick, appraising sweep that reminded me of the way buyers examine property before making an offer. "You said it was important. Something about the family's assets?" I smiled, hiding the way my peripheral vision had begun to soften at the edges like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Sit down, Garrett. I appreciate you coming. I want to simplify some things, consolidate the family's liquid assets into a dedicated fund. A Music Heritage Preservation Trust. Your mother's legacy deserves proper stewardship. The word legacy landed in the room like a tuning fork struck against marble. I watched Garrett's posture change, a subtle straightening of the spine, a slight forward lean that I had seen in musicians who suddenly realize they are about to receive a solo. His eyes, Vivian's dark eyes, sharpened with a focus that had nothing to do with filial devotion and everything to do with the calculation happening behind them. "That sounds responsible, Dad," he said, his voice pitched in what he probably thought was a tone of mature concern. "How much are we talking about?" $295,000. The number hung in the air, like a sustained fortissimo chord. I watched Garrett's reaction with the same intensity I once used to observe a concertmaster's bow during a pianissimo passage, looking for the micro-tremor, the almost invisible deviation from control. His Adam's apple bobbed. His fingers, resting on the arm of the leather chair, began to tap against the fabric in an irregular pattern, not a musical rhythm, but the anxious percussion of a man trying to contain an internal explosion of greed. "Dad, that's significant," he managed, his voice losing its rehearsed calm. "You're sure you don't want to keep it in the Vanguard accounts? I could manage it through a proper vehicle. My firm handles portfolios like this. We could generate real yield." I shook my head slowly. "I want it in a separate high-yield account under your management, Garrett, for specific purposes. Safety nets for the family. Your mother would have wanted it properly protected." The invocation of Vivian was deliberate. I needed to see if her name still carried weight in his conscience. Garrett blinked, a single rapid flutter that could have been emotion, or could have been the reflexive response of a man recalculating an opportunity. I chose to believe it was emotion. That was my first error. We moved to the kitchen table to initiate the wire transfer. I opened my banking portal, and as we sat side by side, I became acutely aware of the symphony of tells emanating from my son's body. His breathing had quickened, shallow inhalations through the mouth, rather than the deep diaphragmatic breaths of a relaxed person. His left foot was tapping beneath the table, at approximately 120 beats per minute allegretto, the tempo of anxiety. And his fingers, those fingers that once struggled through Chopin etudes, under his mother's patient guidance, were now drumming a chaotic polyrhythm against his thigh. In 30 years of conducting, I had trained my ears to detect a single flat note in a 100-piece orchestra. Tonight, every instrument in my son's body was playing out of tune. The transfer completed at 6:47. The confirmation appeared on screen, a green banner declaring that $295,000 had successfully migrated from my account to the one Garrett now controlled. I felt a complex surge of emotion, relief that the mission was secured, pride that I was trusting my son, and beneath it all, a low, dissonant hum of unease that I could not quite name. "I have placed everything in your hands, Garrett," I said, looking directly at him. "The institutional fees will be due by the end of November. Keep the funds ready for when I give the word." "Total control, Dad," he replied, standing up with a new energy that vibrated through his frame like a plucked string still resonating. "You won't have to worry about a thing, I promise." He was halfway to the door before I could offer him coffee or dinner. The haste was remarkable, the eager exit of a performer who had received a standing ovation and was rushing to the after-party before the applause faded. I walked him to the entryway, watching the way he patted his jacket pocket with a compulsive rhythm. As he stepped onto the porch, the hallway light caught something that made my conductor's instincts flare like a warning trumpet in the brass section. In his right jacket pocket, partially concealed by the fold of fabric, was a second phone, smaller, older, its screen flickering with rapid notifications. The light that pulsed from it was a sharp electric green, the kind of color that belongs to scoreboards and betting platforms, not to business communications. Garrett caught me looking. His hand shot into the pocket, killing the vibrations with a squeeze. His face rearranged itself into a mask of casual indifference, a fermata of false calm. "See you soon, Dad," he said, already turning toward his car. Don't stay up too late reading scores. Got to protect those eyes. I stood in the doorway, watching his taillights disappear into the Philadelphia night. And the silence that followed was not the restful silence between movements. It was the loaded silence of a rest that comes just before the entire brass section detonates. Something in the harmonic structure of the evening was wrong, a dissonance so subtle that only ears trained by decades of listening for the invisible could detect it. Trust is like perfect pitch. You either have it or you don't. And something in my son's rhythm was dangerously, irreversibly off-key. The hospital's email arrived at 6:47 in the morning, and it played a note so discordant it woke every nerve in my body before the coffee had finished brewing. I was standing in my kitchen, watching the first pale October light slide across the countertop, when my phone vibrated with the cold efficiency of a medical institution delivering bad news on a schedule. The message was automated, clinical, devoid of human warmth, formatted with the sterile precision of a system designed to process patients like inventory. Dear Mr. Hargrove, this is a courtesy notification from Penn Medicine Billing Services. The required initial deposit of $145,000 for your scheduled neurosurgical procedure has not been received by the October 31st institutional deadline. Please contact our billing department to discuss your payment options. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, my eyes scanning each word with the same focus I once used to check a score for misprints before a premiere performance. The coffee machine beeped behind me, a sharp domestic sound that felt absurdly trivial against the weight of what I was reading. My engineering mind for every conductor is, at his core, an engineer of sound immediately reached for a logical explanation. Wire transfers of this magnitude do not move instantaneously. There are holding periods, compliance checks, institutional friction between banks. Perhaps Garrett had initiated the payment, and it was simply caught in the digital pipeline. A temporary lag. A bureaucratique syncopation. I told myself this for approximately 11 minutes before the deeper, darker truth began to resonate. I called Garrett at 7:15. The phone rang 6 times, then dropped to voicemail, his recorded voice cheerful and professional, a perfectly rehearsed performance for callers who would never know the actor behind it. I left a message, keeping my tone level and measured, the voice of a father asking a simple administrative question, rather than a man watching the walls of his vision slowly close inward, like a stage curtain, at the end of a final act. Garrett, it's Dad. The hospital flagged a billing issue with the initial deposit. Just give me a call when you have sorted the transfer on your end. Nothing urgent. Nothing urgent. I nearly laughed at my own lie. My optic nerve was being strangled by a tumor the size of a walnut, and I was leaving voicemails with the emotional restraint of a man inquiring about a late magazine subscription. He did not call back that day, nor the next, nor the day after that. By the third morning of silence, I had sent 2 emails and left 3 voicemails, each one slightly more pointed than the last, though I maintained the measured cadence of a conductor who refuses to show panic, even when the principal cellist has missed an entrance by 4 bars. The silence from my son's end was not the absence of communication. It was a deliberate, sustained rest, the kind that a musician inserts into a piece not for artistic effect, but to avoid playing a passage they have not rehearsed. On the 4th day, I walked across the hall to my neighbor's apartment. Mrs. Delacroix, a retired French literature professor, with a voice like aged sherry, answered the door with reading glasses perched on her nose and a copy of Flaubert open in her hand. Edmund, what a lovely surprise. Is everything well? Perfectly fine, Claudette. My cell seems to be dropping calls. Would you mind terribly if I used your landline for a quick dial? She handed me the cordless phone without suspicion, and I retreated to her hallway, my back against the wallpaper that smelled of lavender sachets and old paper. I dialed Garrett's number. It rang once, twice. Then, on the 3rd ring, he answered. His voice was bright, energetic, and utterly unburdened. Hey there, Garrett Hargrove speaking. How can I help you? The warmth in his tone hit me like a slap. He sounded like a man without a single unpaid debt in the world, a performer so deep into his role that he had forgotten the audience could see through the costume. "Garrett, it is your father." The silence that followed was not a rest. It was a void, a black hole in the middle of the musical phrase where no sound could survive. I heard his breathing change, the shallow hiss of air through clenched teeth. Then, without a word of greeting, without a syllable of explanation, the line disconnected. A flat, continuous tone filled my ear, the auditory equivalent of a flat line on a cardiac monitor. He had answered because he did not recognize the number, and he had hung up the moment he recognized my voice. I stood in Claudette's hallway, the plastic handset still pressed against my ear, listening to the deadline with the trained patience of a man who once held a fermata for 11 seconds during a performance of Barber's Adagio for strings. The silence told me everything. My son was not delayed by bureaucracy or distracted by business. He was hiding, and the thing he was hiding from was me. That evening, I sat in my darkening apartment and noticed that the edges of my vision had receded further. The peripheral world was dissolving, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of a curtain falling, but with the slow, insidious patience of a tide erasing footprints from sand. I was looking at the Brahms score on my music stand and realized I could no longer see the dynamic markings in the outer margins. The pianissimos were vanishing first. How fitting. The quiet parts always disappear before you notice they are gone. I picked up my phone one final time that night and opened Instagram. Meredith's account was public, a curated gallery of affluence that she maintained with the dedication of a museum director. Her latest posts told a story my son's silence had been trying to conceal. 3 days ago, a carousel of photos from a new recording studio in Fishtown exposed brick, vintage analog equipment, a mixing console that I recognized from a trade magazine as costing upward of $60,000. The caption read, "New chapter, new sound, new energy, blessed beyond measure." The hashtags marched beneath like soldiers in formation. New beginnings, studio life, manifesting greatness, level up. 2 days ago, a story highlight of Meredith and Garrett at a restaurant. I recognized Vernick Food and Drink, where the tasting menu started at $180 per person. She was wearing new diamond earrings. He was wearing confidence like a rented tuxedo, ill-fitting, but expensive enough to fool a casual observer. I closed the app and set the phone face down on the table. The screen went dark, and for a moment, my apartment was perfectly still, the kind of stillness that exists inside a concert hall after the last note has decayed, but before the audience dares to breathe. It was the silence of something ending. In 30 years of conducting, I had learned to hear when an instrument was lying about its tuning. My son was playing a concerto of deception, and every note was flat. The storage unit door opened like the lid of a coffin, and inside, the silence where music used to live was deafening. I stood at the threshold of Unit 217 in the industrial corridor of a facility off Spring Garden Street, my flashlight cutting through the stale darkness with the precision of a conductor's baton, slicing through the opening bar of a funeral march. The air smelled of dust, packing tape, and something else, something recent. The sharp chemical tang of new shoe rubber against concrete. I had not visited this unit in 2 months. Not since the week after Vivian's final arrangements, when I carefully cataloged and stored the instruments, manuscripts, and personal effects that represented 30 years of her musical life. Every item had been placed with the reverence of a museum curator. The viola she played during her student years at Juilliard, wrapped in acid-free tissue. The oboe she had purchased on a whim during our honeymoon in Vienna, and learned to play badly but joyfully. A stack of handwritten manuscripts, original compositions she had penned during long Sunday afternoons, while I studied scores in the next room, her cello humming beneath her fingers like a second heartbeat. And the Stradivarius. The Antonia Stradivarius, crafted in Cremona in 1709, a cello of such extraordinary tonal depth that when Vivian played it, the sound seemed to emanate not from the strings, but from somewhere inside the earth itself. It was valued at $2.8 million, but its true worth was incalculable. It was the voice of a woman who no longer had one, and it was supposed to remain in this family until time itself forgot the name Hargrove. My flashlight beam swept the concrete floor, and my stomach dropped with the sickening velocity of a descending glissando. The dust was not the uniform gray blanket I had left behind. It was scarred deep drag marks gouging through the grime, and the distinct crisp imprints of rubber-soled shoes, size 11. I knew my son's shoe size the way I knew his birth weight, and his blood type information a father carries, without thinking, until it becomes evidence. I moved deeper into the unit, my heart hammering an irregular tempo against my ribs. The shelving unit where Vivian's instruments had been stored looked like a mouth with missing teeth. The viola gone. The oboe gone. The stack of manuscripts gone. Only empty spaces remained. Indentations in the dust where objects of irreplaceable value had rested for 2 years, now marked by nothing but absence. It was like looking at a musical score with all the notes erased, leaving only the empty staves and the ghost of what should have been. I moved to the climate-controlled cabinet in the far corner, the custom-built case I had commissioned specifically for the Stradivarius. It was mahogany with brass fittings, lined in temperature-regulating velvet, equipped with a hygrometer and a lock that required both a key and a combination. The lock was intact. But when I opened the case, the interior stared back at me with the mocking emptiness of a concert hall after everyone has gone home. The velvet still bore the impression of the cello's body, a hollow silhouette in deep blue, curved and feminine, like a wound in the shape of the woman I loved. Gone. 300 years of craftsmanship. 30 years of Vivian's breath and fingerprints soaked into the wood. Gone. I sank onto the old piano bench that served as seating in the unit, my hands gripping the edge until my knuckles whitened. The violation was not merely financial. It was archaeological. My son had excavated the grave of his mother's life and sold the bones for spending money. I stared at the empty velvet impression, and for the first time since the diagnosis, the dimming of my vision felt like a mercy. Perhaps going blind would be easier than seeing what my son had become. My flashlight caught a glint of white near the base of the shelving unit. I bent down, my knees protesting, and picked up a crumpled receipt from a high-end pawnbroker on Jewelers Row. Callahan and Associates, the kind of establishment that deals in estate pieces and asks no uncomfortable questions. The receipt was dated 6 days ago. The items listed were vague, assorted string instruments, antique woodwind, manuscript collection, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. The sharp, impatient scrawl of Garrett Hargrove, written with the casual speed of a man who did not expect anyone to ever read it. He had dropped it. A careless fragment of evidence left behind by someone who believed the witness was already too blind to see. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket, my thumb hovering over Garrett's name. The rage I felt was not hot. It was cold, the sub-zero cold of a concert hall in winter before the heating system engages, the kind of cold that preserves rather than destroys. I pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the oily lightness of a man who has decided that offense is the best defense. Dad. Hey, I was just about to call you back. Things have been crazy with the studio launch. Garrett. I am at the storage unit. A pause. The briefest micro-rest, a 30-second note of silence that told me everything. The Stradivarius is gone, Garrett. Your mother's viola is gone. Her manuscripts are gone. And I am currently holding a receipt from Callahan's with your signature on it. What happened next was not a denial. It was worse. It was a weapon forged from my own vulnerability, aimed directly at the place where I was weakest. Dad, he said, his voice shifting into a tone of practiced, patronizing concern, the falsetto of a man pretending to care. I think you need to sit down. Have you been taking your medication properly? You know, the doctor said. The condition can cause confusion, visual disturbances, memory issues. He paused, letting the poison settle. Maybe you moved things around last time you were there and forgot. Your eyes, Dad. They are getting worse. You said so yourself. He was using my blindness as a shield. He was turning my failing sight into his alibi, weaponizing my diagnosis to make me doubt the evidence of my own hands, my own nose, my own ears. It was not merely theft. It was psychological demolition, a gaslight lit with the fuel of a father's trust. "I am holding your signature, Garrett," I said, my voice dropping to the dangerous pianissimo I once used to silence an entire brass section. "Explain that." "Look, Dad, I have a meeting in 10. We will talk about this later, okay? Just go home. Rest. I will come by this weekend, and we will sort everything out. You are clearly stressed." The line went dead. Not a farewell. Not an apology. Just the cold click of disconnection, a conductor's worst nightmare. The orchestra walking off stage mid-performance. I stood in the yellow fluorescent light of the hallway, the pawn receipt clutched in my hand like a blade, and I understood with absolute clarity that my son had not just stolen from me. He had used my blindness as his alibi. But a conductor does not need eyes to know when the orchestra is playing the wrong score. He needs ears. And mine were sharper than they had ever been. I walked into the audio equipment store on North 3rd Street with the posture of a man buying a weapon, because that is exactly what I was doing. The shop occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in Northern Liberties, a long, narrow space lined with rack-mounted processors, coiled cables, and the kind of specialized recording equipment that most civilians would never have reason to touch. The air smelled of solder and new plastic, a sterile industrial scent that felt appropriate for the mission I was about to undertake. The young man behind the counter, early 20s, beard trimmed to geometric precision, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled, to reveal a tattoo of a sine wave, looked up from his phone with the bored expression of someone accustomed to serving bedroom producers who didn't know the difference between a condenser and a dynamic microphone. "Help you find something?" he asked, already half returning his gaze to his screen. "I need omnidirectional lavalier microphones with a frequency response between 20 Hz and 20 kHz, I said, removing my gloves and setting them on the counter with deliberate precision. "Full spectrum capture. I also need pinhole camera modules. CMOS sensors, not CCD, with infrared capability for low-light environments. Remote storage to encrypted cloud. And I need everything small enough to fit inside the body of a woodwind instrument." The clerk's phone lowered slowly to the counter. His eyebrows rose like a crescendo mark. That's pretty specific, sir. You working on some kind of documentary project?" "Something like that," I replied, my voice carrying the same tone I once used to address an orchestra section that was testing my patience. "I am documenting a performance that the subject does not yet know is being recorded. Consider it a study in human acoustics." I spent the next 90 minutes selecting my instruments of observation with the care of a luthier choosing wood for a new violin. Each piece had to meet specific criteria size constraints dictated by the internal cavities of the objects I planned to use as concealment. Audio sensitivity sufficient to capture whispered conversations across a room, and visual resolution sharp enough to identify faces in the dim ambient light of a recording studio. I selected 3 pinhole cameras, each no larger than the tip of my little finger, with wireless transmission modules that could tunnel through an encrypted VPN to a cloud server I would control from my apartment. I chose 2 omnidirectional microphones, so sensitive they could detect the sound of a heartbeat from across a quiet room. And I purchased a miniature motion-activated transmitter that would alert my phone the moment someone entered the field of view. The total came to $4,200. I paid in cash crisp bills from an envelope I had prepared that morning, leaving no digital trail that Garrett could stumble upon if he ever decided to examine my bank statements the way I had begun examining his. Do you know what makes a surveillance system truly invisible? It is not the size of the hardware or the sophistication of the encryption. It is context. A camera hidden inside a smoke detector is suspicious because smoke detectors do not belong in every room. But a camera hidden inside a musical instrument, inside an object that belongs so naturally in a musician's environment that it becomes invisible through familiarity, that is the architecture of perfect concealment. I drove home and spent the remainder of the evening performing surgery on 2 objects from my personal collection. The first was an antique metronome, a beautiful brass and mahogany piece from the 1870s that I had kept on my desk for decades. I carefully removed the pendulum mechanism, creating a hollow cavity behind the decorative faceplate where I seated a pinhole camera aimed outward through a tiny aperture I drilled into the ornamental scrollwork. The lens was invisible unless you knew precisely where to look and what you were looking for. The second object was more personal, and preparing it required a steadiness of hand that my grief nearly undermined. It was Vivian's practice oboe, not the professional instrument she used in performance, but the battered, beloved student model she had purchased at a flea market in 1982 and kept for decades simply because it made her laugh to play it badly. I had given it to Garrett years ago as a decorative piece for his first office, and he had returned it to me when he moved studios. Now I hollowed out a section of the bell, seating a second camera and a microphone with enough sensitivity to capture a conversation at normal volume from 15 feet away. The following afternoon I drove to Garrett's studio in Fishtown. I called ahead a brief, casual message, letting him know I had found some old pieces while cleaning and thought they would look wonderful in his new space. He agreed with suspicious enthusiasm, probably relieved that I seemed to have forgotten the storage unit confrontation. I arrived with the metronome and the oboe wrapped in a cloth bag, and Garrett met me at the door with the over-eager hospitality of a man trying to smooth over an unspoken crime. The studio was everything Instagram had promised. Exposed brick, vintage analog equipment, a mixing console that gleamed with new purchase arrogance. It smelled of fresh paint and expensive ambition. "These are beautiful, Dad," Garrett said, taking the metronome and setting it on a shelf directly opposite his desk. "Very aesthetic. The clients will love them." He placed the oboe on a high shelf near the window, a position that gave the hidden camera a panoramic view of the entire workspace, including his computer screen, his desk drawers, and the door to the back room where I suspected he conducted his less legitimate business. "Your mother would have liked this space," I said, looking directly at the oboe, and knowing that Vivian's instrument was now watching over the room with the same quiet vigilance she once used to watch over our family. I drove home as the sun set over the Schuylkill River, the orange light painting the water in shades of fire and copper. Back in my apartment, I opened the secure application on my laptop and paired the devices. The screen divided into two feeds, the metronome's view of the desk area, and the oboe's sweeping coverage of the full studio. Both crystal clear, both recording. I tested the audio. A car horn from the street below Garrett's studio came through with startling clarity, every frequency present, every harmonic intact. I could hear the low hum of the studio's HVAC system, the distant rhythm of footsteps in the hallway above, and the almost subliminal buzz of Garrett's computer fan. The spectrum was complete, 20 Hz to 20 kHz. The full range of human betrayal, captured in high fidelity. "Signal clear," I whispered to the empty room. "Frequencies locked. The instruments are tuned. Every great symphony needs a rest before the crescendo." Mine was the silence of a father learning to listen without love getting in the way. The microphones were live. The cameras were recording. And my son had no idea he was performing for an audience of one. The first audio file lasted 47 minutes. By minute 3, I wished I had gone deaf instead of blind. I sat in the dark of my apartment, the laptop screen casting a cold blue glow across my reading glasses, and I listened to my son dismantle the last of my faith with the casual efficiency of a man clearing out a closet he no longer needed. The timestamp read 11:14 at night, 3 days after I had placed the instruments in his studio, and the footage showed Garrett alone at his desk, his face lit by the sickly glow of multiple browser tabs. The oboe's microphone captured everything with merciless clarity. I could hear the click of his mouse, the rapid-fire tapping of keys, and beneath it all, the low murmur of a live-stream commentary, the excited cadence of an esports announcer calling a Counter-Strike 2 tournament match. Garrett was leaning forward in his chair, his body tense with the coiled energy of a gambler watching his money ride on the aim of a 19-year-old in Seoul. "Come on, come on, come on," he muttered, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with desperation. "Close it out. Close the round." I watched the reflection in his monitor glasses. The scoreboard, the odds, the balance of an account that should have contained my surgical deposit. The numbers were moving with sickening speed. Down. Always down. The next recording was from 2 days later. This one featured a phone call. Garrett pacing the studio floor, his voice tight, with the strained bravado of a man negotiating with someone who held his leash. "I am good for it," he said into his phone, his free hand pulling at the collar of his shirt, as if it were tightening around his throat. "The league finals are this weekend. I have inside information on the draft picks. Just give me the extension, and I will cover the spread by Monday." The voice on the other end was inaudible, a low rumble that the microphone could not fully resolve. But Garrett's responses painted a vivid picture of a man drowning in obligations he could never meet. He mentioned figures, 15,000 here, 40,000 there, numbers that fell from his mouth like coins dropping into a bottomless well. The esports betting was not a hobby, it was a hemorrhage. And my $295,000 had been the tourniquet he applied to a wound that refused to stop bleeding. But the recording that destroyed me, the one that reached into my chest and pulled out whatever remained of my paternal instinct, came on the 5th night of surveillance. It was 9:43 in the evening. Meredith had come to the studio, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the sharp authority of a woman who believed herself entitled to everything within earshot. She dropped her purse on the mixing console and turned to face Garrett with the cold directness of a business partner demanding a progress report. "The storage unit," she said, her arms crossed. "Tell me you finished." Garrett was seated at his desk, his shoulders hunched forward in the posture of a man who had stopped pretending to have a spine. "I got the rest of the manuscripts and the small pieces. Took them to Callahan's yesterday. Got 11,000 for the lot." 11? Meredith's voice sharpened. "That collection was worth triple that. You let them rob you. I needed cash fast, Mer. The tournament buy-in was last night." Meredith's silence was surgical, a scalpel held steady before the first incision. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, more calculated. "And the big one? The cello?" Garrett rubbed his face with both hands. "Victor Crane in New York. He offered 1.9 million. It is worth 2.8, but he knows I am desperate. He could smell it." 1.9, Meredith repeated, and I could hear the smile in her voice, not warmth, but the cold satisfaction of a predator seeing the trap close. "That will cover the debts and leave enough for the kitchen renovation." "When does the wire hit?" "Already in. But most of it is already spoken for. The offshore accounts, the buy-ins I already committed to." "Then commit to less," she snapped. "I am not living in a house with last year's appliances because you cannot stop clicking buttons." There was a pause. A long, terrible rest in the middle of a composition I no longer wanted to hear. Then Garrett said the words that severed the last thread of mercy in my heart. "It does not matter anyway," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that the microphone caught with devastating precision. "He is going blind, anyway. The collection is wasted on a man who cannot even see the notes anymore. It is better this money works for us now. Before, it all just sits there collecting dust in a dead woman's name." A dead woman's name. Vivian. My wife. His mother. Reduced to a possessive noun in a sentence about liquidating her soul for gambling money. Meredith did not flinch. She did not correct him or express a moment of discomfort at the casual cruelty of his words. Instead, she leaned against the console and asked the question that turned theft into something far more sinister. "What about the life insurance situation? Did the broker call back?" Garrett nodded without looking up. "They rejected the application. Pre-existing condition. The tumor makes him uninsurable. So we wait," Meredith said, straightening her jacket. "The estate clears everything once he is gone. The house, the pension, whatever is left in Vanguard. We just need him to stay quiet until then." I pressed pause. The screen froze on an image of my son and his wife, two silhouettes in the dim studio light, their faces half illuminated by the glow of a computer screen showing a betting platform's dashboard. They were not grieving. They were not conflicted. They were planning, calculating, scheduling my disappearance, the way one schedules a renovation, an inconvenience to be managed, until the space becomes available. I closed the laptop and sat in complete darkness, my hands flat on the desk, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my fingertips. My vision was dimming, the tumor's slow curtain continuing its merciless descent, but what I had just witnessed was burned into my mind with a clarity no blindness could erase. I had spent my life turning noise into beauty. Now I had to turn my son's ugliest confession into evidence. I needed someone who understood the anatomy of a lie, as well as I understood the anatomy of a fugue. Roland Voss sat across from me at Reading Terminal Market, eating a soft pretzel with the calm efficiency of a man who had once dismantled a Ponzi scheme over his lunch break. The morning crowd flowed around us, tourists photographing Amish baked goods, commuters grabbing coffee, but our booth in the corner existed in its own pocket of gravity. The air smelled of roasted coffee, smoked meats, and the wet stone of a building that had been housing commerce since 1893. Roland was 59, built like a man who never stopped training for a fight that might arrive without warning. He wore a nondescript gray jacket, slightly too large, and his eyes moved in constant practice sweeps of the surrounding space. We had been chess partners for 12 years at the Rittenhouse Square Community Center, a weekly ritual of silence and strategy that had forged the kind of trust requiring no frequent conversation. He was a former federal investigator who spent 23 years in the Financial Crimes Division, dismantling fraud with the same systematic patience I once used to rehearse a symphony to perfection. He did not say hello. He simply looked at the tremor in my hands, then at my eyes, and spoke. "You look like a man whose structural integrity is failing, Edmund. And you did not call me at 5 in the morning to discuss the Sicilian defense." I placed a metal thumb drive on the table between us. It sat on the worn marble like a bullet waiting to be loaded. 40 years with the Philadelphia Orchestra, I said. 30 years married to a woman who played Stradivarius like it was an extension of her soul, a diagnosis giving me 10 weeks to save my sight, and a son who took the surgery money and fed it into esports gambling while telling his wife my blindness makes the theft irrelevant. Roland set down his pretzel. He picked up the drive, turning it between his fingers. "How much?" $295,000 for the surgery fund, plus my wife's instrument collection, including a Stradivarius cello, valued at $2.8 million. He sold it for $1.9 to a collector in New York. Total exposure, approximately $600,000. He plugged the drive into a ruggedized tablet from his jacket. The screen reflected in his eyes as he scrolled the night vision footage of Garrett loading manuscripts, the audio of "He is going blind anyway," the banking screenshots. His face hardened with each file. "I have chased embezzlers who at least had the decency to feel guilty," he murmured. "Your boy does not even have the courtesy of shame." I leaned forward. "I need the full financial picture. Every account, every transaction, every debt. Who he owes, how much, and where the Stradivarius physically is right now." Roland closed the tablet and set it beside his coffee. His expression shifted, a flicker of hesitation I had rarely seen in 12 years. "I have to tell you something, Edmund. I was not entirely surprised by your call. I waited. 3 weeks ago, I saw Garrett at Rivers Casino. Not on the main floor, in the private gaming lounge upstairs. He was with 2 men I did not recognize. Younger, aggressive, the kind who carry encrypted phones and avoid eye contact with strangers. He was handing them cash. Thick envelopes. They did not look satisfied with the amount. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I processed this new data with the same detached intensity I used when a rehearsal went catastrophically wrong. "You knew. And you did not tell me. I suspected. I did not have proof. And I would not detonate a father-son relationship without certainty. But when you called this morning at 5, I knew the proof had arrived." I pushed the coldness aside. There would be time for the calculus of who knew what and when. Right now I needed his skills more than his apology. Complete financial tracing, gambling platforms, offshore accounts, loan operations, current confirmed location of the Stradivarius, names and leverage points of whoever is collecting his debts. 10 days. Roland held my gaze, the evaluating stare of a man measuring whether his friend understood the gravity of the request. You are asking me to compose a case against your own blood, Edmund. You understand there is no unplaying that note? I did not flinch. He stopped being my blood the moment he decided my blindness was a business opportunity. Find the money, Roland. I will handle the rest. Roland stood, pocketing the thumb drive with smooth economy. He looked down at me, his hand resting briefly on the table edge. Consider the overture complete, Edmund. Now we begin the first movement, and your son will not know he is the subject until the final chord drops. He did not ask for a retainer. He simply turned and disappeared into the morning crowd with the anonymity of a rest between measures, silent, but loaded with intent. I sat alone, the market noise washing over me like the tuning chaos of an orchestra before the concertmaster's A. The hunt had officially begun, and for the first time since the diagnosis, the countdown behind my eyes felt less like a death sentence and more like a metronome, steady, purposeful, driving toward a resolution I was fully committed to conducting. Data does not carry sentiment, which is why it was the only thing I could trust to tell me the truth about my son's soul. Roland's report landed on my coffee table with the weight of a condemned man's sentence, and every page was a new movement in my son's symphony of destruction. 10 days had passed since our meeting at Reading Terminal Market. 10 days of excruciating patience, where the only things keeping me upright were the mechanical discipline of my daily routine and the stubborn refusal to let my narrowing vision become my epitaph. When the knock came at 7 in the evening, I moved slowly to the door. Roland stood in the hallway, the scent of cold November air clinging to his jacket. He carried a thick manila folder and an expression I had never seen on his face in 12 years of chess, something between professional disgust and personal grief. "It is worse than we calculated, Edmund," he said, sitting on the edge of my sofa without removing his coat. "Significantly worse." He opened the folder and began laying documents across my coffee table with the methodical precision of a man building a prosecution. Bank statements, transaction logs, screenshots of betting platforms, printed text message chains. Each page was a new knife, and Roland handed them to me one at a time, allowing the damage to accumulate in sequence. The gambling losses came first. Roland had traced Garrett's activity across 4 separate esports betting platforms, 2 domestic, 2 offshore. The pattern was textbook addiction escalation. Small bets in the spring 500 on a League of Legends championship match, 1,000 on a Counter-Strike tournament bracket. By summer, the stakes had climbed to 5,000 and 10,000 per event. And then, in mid-October, 3 days after I transferred my surgical fund, the amounts exploded. 50,000 on a single CS2 major final. 75,000 on a League of Legends World Championship Series. The deposits came directly from the account I had entrusted to him, my $295,000 atomized into digital wagers on teenage gamers, playing for trophies in arenas halfway across the world. "Total confirmed losses from your transferred funds," Roland said, his finger tracing a highlighted column. $280,000, gone in 26 days. I processed the number the way I once processed a wrong note in a live performance, acknowledging it, containing the damage internally, and continuing forward without letting the audience see the fracture. 26 days. My son had incinerated a lifetime of savings in less time than it takes to rehearse a Beethoven cycle. The Stradivarius was next. Roland confirmed the buyer, Victor Crane, a private collector operating out of a brownstone on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Crane specialized in acquiring instruments from distressed sellers, purchasing below market value, and holding until the provenance disputes cooled. He had paid $1.9 million, a full $900,000 below the cello's appraised value, because Garrett had walked in desperate, sweating, and willing to sign anything that produced immediate liquidity. "Most of the Crane money is already gone as well," Roland said. $1.2 million went directly into a cryptocurrency exchange account, and then into a series of esports prediction markets. The remaining $700,000 was split between loan repayments and what I can only describe as lifestyle maintenance, the studio lease, Meredith's credit lines, a membership at a private social club in Rittenhouse. The next page made my blood feel like ice water. It was a rejected application for a life insurance policy, $2 million, with Garrett named as sole beneficiary and me as the insured party. The application had been filed 11 days after my diagnosis. The rejection letter cited my pre-existing condition as disqualifying, but the intent was as clear as a fortissimo marking on a score. He was not merely waiting for me to die. He had tried to make my death profitable. He did not just gamble your surgery fund, Roland said quietly. He attempted to monetize your expiration. I turned to the final section. Printed text messages, a chain between Garrett and an individual Roland had identified only as V. The messages were short, aggressive, and stripped of any pretense of civility. Garrett owed this person $150,000. The threats were escalating references to visits, to collateral reassessment, to consequences that existed outside the boundaries of legal commerce. But one message, sent from Garrett's phone just 4 days ago, stopped my breath entirely. It read, "The old man will not last. The estate will cover everything within the quarter. Just give me until February." He was not just spending my money. He was scheduling my death as a payment deadline. My son had converted my remaining lifespan into a line item on a debt repayment plan, a variable to be solved, not a life to be saved. "There is one more thing," Roland said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a series of photographs. "My associate has been running counter-surveillance on your building for the past week." He laid 3 images on the table, grainy but clear. A black Chevrolet Tahoe with tinted windows, parked across from my apartment on 2 separate occasions. A dark gray sedan making a slow pass at 11 at night. These vehicles are registered to shell corporations with no physical addresses. They are connected to the lending operation Garrett is involved with. They are watching you, Edmund. They believe you are the collateral. The photograph sat on my table, like evidence from someone else's life. I looked at them, then at Roland, and felt the last vestige of sentimentality drain from my body like air, leaving a punctured bellows. "Let them watch," I said, my voice dropping to the dangerous pianissimo. I reserved for moments of absolute resolve. They are about to discover that the vault is empty, and the architect is still very much armed. Roland gathered the documents back into the folder, leaving it on the table. He stood, buttoning his coat. "What is your next move, Edmund?" I looked at the digital clock on the wall, red numbers blinking with mechanical indifference. My surgical window was closing, the tumor pressing harder each day, the peripheral world shrinking like a stage going dark. But Garrett had forgotten something about the man who raised him. A conductor always builds redundancy into the score. If the first violin fails, the second is already waiting with the same passage memorized. "My son is composing a requiem for my life," I said, standing to face Roland. "He has already scheduled the funeral, before the last breath has left my lungs. But requiems are written for the dead, and I have no intention of taking my final bow." I titled the spreadsheet Operation Encore, because in music, an encore is what you play when the audience believes the performance is already over. My son had written me off as a finished composition, a piece whose final bar had already been inked. He was about to discover that the conductor still had one more movement in reserve. I sat at my desk in the blue dark hours of a November morning, the laptop screen casting its cold light across the scattered pages of Roland's dossier. My vision had narrowed further. Overnight, the tunnel was closing, the world outside its shrinking aperture fading into a soft gray nothingness that reminded me of fog rolling across the Schuylkill at dawn. I had weeks, not months, and every hour I spent planning was an hour the tumor spent pressing. I began mapping the mission with the same methodical precision I once used to prepare a concert season, identifying the resources, calculating the timeline, establishing the critical path. The target was $145,000, the minimum deposit Penn Medicine required to hold my surgical slot. Everything else, the legal response, the confrontation, the justice, could wait. But the surgery could not. My first call went out at 7 in the morning. Benjamin Adler, retired concertmaster of the Philadelphia Orchestra, a man whose bow arm I had guided through 2 decades of first-chair excellence. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the warm, papery quality of a man who still woke at dawn out of rehearsal habit. "Edmund," he said, "I heard whispers you were dealing with something. Tell me what you need." 30,000, Benjamin. I am consulting on a private preservation project and have hit a bridge issue. Short term. I will have it back to you within 6 months. There was no hesitation, no questions about collateral or interest, just the scratch of a pen. You pulled me out of the worst performance anxiety of my career in '94, Edmund. The Brahms Concerto. I was shaking so badly I could not hold the bow. You stood behind me and said, "The music already exists, Benjamin. You are simply the messenger." I have never forgotten. The money is yours. The second call, Margaret Yun, former principal oboist, now running an arts foundation in Bryn Mawr. 40,000. She wired it before I finished explaining the consulting arrangement. The third, David Osei, a percussionist who had become a successful recording studio owner. 35,000, transferred with a text message that read simply, "Musicians protect their conductors. Always." It is a strange mathematics, the people you have not spoken to in years, valuing your survival more than the man who carries your name and was supposed to carry your legacy. By mid-afternoon, the survival column showed $145,000. The target was met. But there remained one final piece of the composition that required a soloist of extraordinary caliber. I opened my email and composed a message to an address I had not used in 3 years. Nikolai.Petrov@WienerPhilharmoniker. Nikolai Petrov. 45 years old, concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic. And, before all of that, a 17-year-old boy from a crumbling apartment block in Moscow's Kapotnya district, playing a battered violin in a metro station for coins, whom I had discovered during a guest conducting engagement in 1999. I had heard him from the platform, a sound so pure, so structurally perfect amidst the noise and the filth of the underground, that I missed my train and stood listening for 11 minutes. I found him a scholarship. I mentored him for 6 years. I watched him become one of the finest string players of his generation. He called me maestro. He called me the man who gave him a life worth living. My email was brief. I explained the Stradivarius, its sale to Victor Crane, its current location in a Manhattan brownstone. I did not ask Nikolai to buy it. I simply told him where it was and what it meant. His response arrived 47 minutes later. "Maestro. That cello carried Mrs. Hargrove's soul for 30 years. I would mortgage my house in Vienna to bring it home. You do not need to ask twice. I am booking a flight to New York tonight. Crane will sell to me, I know his type. They worship provenance, and I am the Vienna Philharmonic. Consider the instrument recovered. And Edmund, when the time comes to play it again, I will be there. Just say the word." I closed the email and pressed my palms flat against the desk, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my fingertips. Vivian's Stradivarius was coming home. The surgery fund was secured. Now I needed to schedule the operation and ensure Garrett believed I was nowhere near a hospital. I called Penn Medicine's billing department and spoke to a supervisor, a woman named Patricia, whose voice carried the efficient warmth of someone accustomed to managing life or death logistics. I confirmed the $145,000 deposit and requested a slot adjustment. "December 2nd, I said. "I need that window." She hesitated. "Mr. Hargrove, that is 12 days from now. We typically require—" "We are not dealing with a typical situation, Patricia. The funding is confirmed. The wire will arrive by end of business tomorrow. I need that date." A pause. Keys tapping. Then, confirmed. December 2nd. Pre-operative consultation, November 29th. "We will see you then, Mr. Hargrove." The slot was locked. The funding was secure. The Stradivarius was in transit. Now I needed to disappear. I set up a honeypot, a small accessible account, containing exactly $3,000, linked to an alert system that would notify Roland the instant anyone touched it. Then I called Garrett. He answered with suspicious cheerfulness, his voice performing the role of a dutiful son with all the conviction of a community theater understudy. "Dad, hey. I was going to call you this week. How are you feeling?" "I am feeling restless, Garrett," I said, keeping my voice light. "I have been invited to guest conduct a short tour in Europe, Vienna, then Prague. A farewell engagement of sorts. I leave tomorrow and will be gone for 3 weeks. No cell service in most of the venues. I just wanted you to know." The relief in his voice was instantaneous. A held note, finally releasing into silence. "That sounds wonderful, Dad. Really good for you. Get some fresh air. Clear your head. We will catch up when you are back." He did not ask which orchestra. He did not ask about my health. He simply heard 3 weeks and gone, and calculated the freedom those words contained. The funding was secured. The Stradivarius was coming home. The surgery was scheduled. And my son, believing I was 10,000 miles away chasing a standing ovation, was about to discover that the real performance was happening right here in Philadelphia, and he was the only one in the theater without a program. I packed a hospital bag the way I once packed for opening night at Carnegie Hall, with the understanding that everything depended on the performance of strangers, and that I would either walk out into applause or be carried out in silence. The suitcase was small. Hospital gown, slippers, a paperback copy of Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, a novel about a composer who trades his soul for genius, which felt grimly appropriate. I did not pack photographs. I did not bring Vivian's wedding ring or my conductor's baton. If something went wrong on the table, I did not want Garrett to find anything worth selling in my personal effects. The drive to Penn Medicine at 5 in the morning on December 2nd was a study in controlled solitude. The heater in my car barely touched the cold, and the Philadelphia streets were empty save for the occasional delivery truck and the blue-white glow of traffic signals cycling through their automated rhythm for an audience of no one. I watched the road ahead through my narrowing tunnel of vision. The world reduced to a bright central corridor surrounded by encroaching darkness, like driving through an endless closing iris. I checked my phone at a red light. No messages. Garrett believed I was somewhere over the Atlantic, drifting toward a concert stage that did not exist. The fiction was holding. I allowed myself a thin, private smile, the kind a conductor permits himself in the wings before stepping onto the podium, when the house lights dim and the silence becomes electric with possibility. The clinical ritual of pre-operative preparation is an exercise in surrendering control, a concept profoundly uncomfortable for a man who spent 30 years dictating tempo to 100 musicians. Nurse Martinez, a woman whose hands moved with the practiced grace of a first-chair violinist, checked my vitals with efficient warmth. She noted the empty chair beside my bed, then looked at my chart, then back at the chair. "No one coming to sit with you today, Mr. Hargrove?" I looked at the white ceiling tiles, counting them the way I once counted measures during an orchestral rest. "I am a solo performer tonight, nurse. Just get the instruments tuned and ready." She offered a smile that suggested she had heard that kind of bravery before, and recognized it for what it was, a thin shell over a vast and terrifying loneliness. She inserted the IV line with a precision I respected. Cold, clean. The first chemical overture of the journey ahead. Roland's wife, Catherine, a retired surgical nurse with eyes that could spot a lie or a lethal arrhythmia from across the room, arrived at 6:45 and took the chair beside my bed. She was my perimeter, my contingency. If Garrett somehow discovered the ruse and appeared at this hospital looking for his inheritance early, Catherine would be the wall he could not climb. She carried a crossword puzzle, a thermos of black coffee, and the steady, unshakable presence of a woman who had spent 30 years in operating theaters and feared nothing that walked on 2 legs. "Roland sends his regards," she said, settling in. "He is monitoring the honeypot. The moment your son touches it, we will know." I nodded. The sedative was beginning to pull at the edges of my consciousness, a warm chemical tide rising from the IV drip. "If I do not come back from this, Catherine, the legal packet is with Christopher Ward on Walnut Street. Everything is already filed." "You are coming back, Edmund," she said, turning a page of her crossword without looking up. Stubborn men always do. The orderlies arrived at 7:15. The hallway lights passed overhead in rhythmic strobe as they wheeled me toward the surgical wing fluorescent constellations, sliding past like the notes of a whole-tone scale, each one dissolving into the next, without resolution. The operating room was a cathedral of stainless steel and blue light, and I observed its architecture with the professional appreciation of a man who understood that precision environments produce precise outcomes. Dr. Khatri appeared above me, her face masked, her eyes steady. "We are going to take excellent care of you, Edmund. Count down from 10. 10. 9. 8. The anesthesia entered my system like a slow decrescendo, the world fading from fortissimo to pianissimo to silence. 7. 6. The last thing I heard before the dark claimed me was the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor, and I thought, that is my tempo now. That machine is conducting me. I woke to light. Not the harsh fluorescent assault of the operating room, but the softer, diffused glow of a recovery ward at midday. My first conscious sensation was pain, a deep structural ache behind my forehead that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. But beneath the pain, something extraordinary. The edges were back, the periphery that had been dissolving for weeks, the margins of the world that had been fading into soft gray absence were returning, faint, fragile, but present. I could see the corners of the ceiling. I could see the doorframe in my peripheral vision without turning my head. The tumor was gone. The nerve was free. I reached for my phone on the bedside table. The screen lit up, and I read it clearly, every pixel, every letter sharp and defined. The date read December 2nd, 4:17 in the afternoon. Notifications. 0 missed calls. 0 text messages from Garrett. Catherine appeared at my bedside. Roland called 20 minutes ago. Your son triggered the honeypot account 6 hours after your supposed departure. Drained all 3,000 before noon. I closed my eyes. The confirmation was not surprising, but it carried a specific weight, the final data point, in an equation I had already solved. My son had not waited even a full day before reaching into my pockets. The days that followed blurred into a sequence of recovery milestones, walking the corridor, breathing exercises, the gradual return of visual acuity that made each morning feel like unwrapping a gift I had nearly lost forever. Catherine remained my only visitor. Roland sent updates via encrypted text. Garrett had attempted to access my frozen Vanguard account twice, had been to the bank demanding information, had called my cell phone exactly 0 times. On December 15th, 2 weeks into my recovery, I asked the floor nurse for a printout of incoming calls to my room in the hospital switchboard. I scanned the list: Catherine's number, Roland's encrypted line, the billing department's internal extensions. My son had never called. Not once. Not to ask about my fictitious concert tour. Not to ask why I had not sent a postcard or a text. Not to ask if I was alive. But Roland had found one outgoing call from Garrett's office to Penn Medicine's billing department. The inquiry was not about my health. It was about my scheduled procedure. He had called to ask whether the surgery had been canceled, hoping to confirm that the money he stole had successfully killed the operation. He was not checking on his father. He was checking on his investment. My eyes could see again. The world had edges, depth, and color that I had nearly lost forever. And the first thing they saw with perfect clarity was the absolute echoing void where my son's love should have been. He had not called to check if I was alive. He had called to check if I was dead. I was discharged on December 20th, with a healing incision beneath my hairline, and a world that had edges again. The paperwork took 40-minute signatures, medication schedules, follow-up appointments, and I completed each form with the slow, deliberate pleasure of a man who could read every line of fine print without squinting. The letters were sharp. The margins were visible. The darkness that had been eating my periphery for 2 months was gone, replaced by the clean, vivid clarity of a restored instrument finally playing in tune. I spent the next 4 days preparing for Christmas Eve, the way a general prepares for a siege, with precision, contingency planning, and the cold understanding that mercy was no longer a variable in the equation. My apartment became a command center. Roland's dossier spread across the dining table. The laptop, fully charged, containing every frame of surveillance footage organized into a presentation sequence designed for maximum emotional devastation. A digital recorder, slim as a fountain pen, pinned to the inside lining of my charcoal jacket. And in my leather satchel, the legal packet prepared by my attorney Christopher Ward, a police report for elder financial abuse and grand larceny, a civil lawsuit for $395,000, a temporary restraining order, and an eviction notice for the house in Bryn Mawr that Garrett believed was his, but had always belonged to my LLC. On December 22nd, Nikolai Petrov landed at Philadelphia International Airport on a flight from Vienna. He carried one piece of luggage and one instrument case, a custom-built carbon fiber container holding Vivian's Stradivarius, recovered from Victor Crane's Manhattan collection for $2.1 million. Nikolai had refused my offer to repay him. "This is not a transaction, maestro," he said over the phone, his accent still carrying the ghost of Moscow. "This is a debt I have owed your family for 25 years. Consider it settled." We met briefly at a cafe near Rittenhouse Square. I had not seen him in person since Vivian's funeral, and the sight of him taller than I remembered, his face carrying the weathered confidence of a man who performed for kings, stirred something in my chest that I had not allowed myself to feel in weeks. He handed me a small velvet box. Inside was Vivian's conductor's baton, the one she had given me on our 30th anniversary, carved from ebony with a silver ferrule engraved with a single treble clef. I had assumed it was lost with the other stolen items. Nikolai had found it at a secondary dealer in Philadelphia and bought it back without telling me. "She would want you to have it in your hand for what comes next," he said simply. I outlined the plan for Christmas Eve. Nikolai would arrive at Garrett's house 1 hour before me, entering through the back garden door that I knew was never locked. He would wait in the first-floor guest room, directly adjacent to the dining room with the Stradivarius. When I sent a single text message, he would begin playing. The piece would be Lullaby for My Little Conductor, the composition Vivian wrote for Garrett the night he was born, and played for him every evening until he was 5 years old. Nikolai listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he simply nodded. "I will be invisible until the moment you need music to do what words cannot." Christmas Eve arrived with the weight of a held breath. I dressed in my charcoal suit, smoothed my silver hair, and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. The scar beneath my hairline was hidden. My eyes, my restored, functioning eyes, were clear and steady. I looked like a man attending a holiday dinner. I looked like a man with nothing to hide. The performance was perfect. I drove to Bryn Mawr at 6 in the evening, the suburban streets glittering with holiday lights that reflected off the fresh dusting of snow. The houses in this neighborhood were large and well kept, their windows warm with the amber glow of families gathered in celebration. Garrett's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a Georgian colonial I had purchased through a quiet LLC 8 years ago when his first development firm collapsed and he needed stability. He believed the mortgage was in his name. It was not. It had never been. I parked on the street, took one breath, and reached for the leather satchel on the passenger seat. Inside it, the laptop, the legal packet, the recorder, and the velvet box containing Vivian's baton. I checked my phone, one text from Nikolai. "In position. Guest room. Ready when you are, maestro." I walked up the front path, my shoes crunching softly on the salted stone. The front door wreath was enormous white lilies and silver ribbons that probably cost more than a month of legitimate income. I rang the bell. The door opened, and Garrett's face appeared in the warm rectangle of light. For one suspended second, a fermata lasting an eternity, his expression was pure, undiluted shock. His skin drained to the color of parchment. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He had expected his father to be 10,000 miles away, chasing applause in Vienna. Instead, I was standing on his doorstep, very much alive, very much present, and very much able to see every flicker of guilt that crossed his face. "Dad?" His voice cracked on the single syllable. I thought you were in Europe. The tour. Finished early, I said, stepping past him into the foyer, with the calm authority of a conductor walking to the podium. The orchestra was not up to standard. I decided to come home for Christmas instead. You do not mind, do you? He could not refuse without revealing his desperation for my absence. He stammered something about being thrilled, about setting an extra place, about Meredith making her special glazed ham. But his hands were shaking, and his eyes, Vivian's dark eyes corrupted by avarice, were already scanning me for clues about what I knew and what I had come to do. The dinner lasted 43 minutes. I counted every one. Meredith performed her role, the gracious hostess, showing off new china, new stemware, a centerpiece that required its own lighting consultation. She spoke about her blog's growth, about brand partnerships, about a kitchen renovation planned for January. Every luxury in this house had been purchased with stolen breath and pawned legacies, and she narrated each acquisition as if reading a catalog of her own crimes without a trace of self-awareness. I ate nothing. I sipped water. I watched. Then, at 7:27, I set my glass down on the table with a deliberate clink that cut through Meredith's monologue like a baton, striking a music stand. "Garrett," I said, my voice level as a horizon line. "Did the hospital receive the December payment?" The room fell silent. Not the comfortable silence between movements of a symphony, but the terrible, suffocating silence of an orchestra realizing they have been playing the wrong piece entirely. And I was about to show them the correct score. Garrett's fork slipped from his fingers and struck the plate with a sound like a cracked bell, a single dissonant note that marked the precise moment the composition changed key. His face had gone the color of wet plaster, and his jaw worked back and forth in a silent mechanical rhythm, a man trying to start an engine that had already seized. Meredith's thumb froze mid-scroll, her phone hovering inches from her face like a shield she had forgotten how to deploy. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted. "Dad, it is Christmas Eve," Garrett finally managed, his voice thin as a reed being played without breath support. "Can we not just the payment is there were some processing delays. The bank flagged the transfer for compliance review. It is being handled." I did not respond to the lie. I simply reached into the leather satchel beside my chair, pulled out the laptop, and placed it directly on the white linen tablecloth, pushing the crystal wine glasses aside with the same deliberation I once used to adjust a music stand before a downbeat. The machine hummed to life, its screen casting a cold blue glow across the remains of dinner, the half-carved ham, the untouched Brussels sprouts, the wine stains that were about to become the least of Garrett's concerns. "Since your memory appears to be malfunctioning," I said, opening the presentation file Roland and I had assembled, "allow me to provide the score. I believe you will recognize the venue. I certainly hope you recognize the performer." I pressed play. The screen filled with night vision footage, the green-gray palette of the oboe camera capturing Garrett at his studio desk at 11:14 on a Tuesday night. There he was, leaning forward in his chair, his face illuminated by the glow of an esports betting platform, his fingers hammering the keyboard with the frantic energy of a man chasing losses he could never recover. The audio was crystal clear, the click of the mouse, the muffled commentary of a Counter-Strike tournament stream, and Garrett's voice, muttering, come on, close the round with the desperate intensity of a prayer to a God who only answers in negative numbers. That is my studio, Garrett whispered, his eyes locked on the screen. When did you? Keep watching, I said. The footage cut to the second recording, the one that had broken me. The timestamp read 9:43 on a Thursday evening. Meredith entered the frame, her heels clicking against the hardwood. The conversation unfolded with devastating clarity. The manuscript sold for $11,000. Victor Crane's offer of $1.9 million for the Stradivarius. The casual accounting of a mother's legacy, converted into gambling chips. And then the words. The 7 words that had severed the last thread of mercy in my heart. Now playing through the laptop speakers with a fidelity that made them sound as if they were being spoken directly into the room. He is going blind anyway. The collection is wasted on a man who cannot even see the notes anymore. It is better this money works for us now. Garrett's own voice filled the dining room, his words bouncing off the crystal chandelier, the Italian leather chairs, the abstract paintings bought with stolen funds. He heard himself, and the sound appeared to physically wound him. His shoulders curled inward, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the floor were tilting beneath him. Meredith had gone completely rigid. Her face was a mask of calculation, not guilt, not shame, but the rapid processing of a woman assessing which lifeboat to board first. Her eyes moved between the laptop screen and the front door, measuring distances. I paused the video. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized, a concert hall holding its breath between the penultimate chord and the final resolution. "I have more," I said. My voice as measured as a metronome. I opened a second file, a spreadsheet. Roland had compiled $280,000. Lost to esports betting platforms in 26 days. Counter-Strike. League of Legends. Digital gambling on children playing video games for trophies, and you funded it with the money I gave you to save my site. Garrett made a sound something between a gasp and a moan, but I was not finished. $1.9 million. That is what you received for your mother's Stradivarius. A 300-year-old instrument she played for 30 years, sold for 68% of its value, because you were too desperate to negotiate. And where did that money go, Garrett? I turned the laptop to show the cryptocurrency exchange transactions. Into prediction markets. Into offshore accounts. Into a hole so deep that 1.9 million was not enough to fill it. I reached into the satchel again and produced a printed page, the rejection letter for the life insurance policy. I slid it across the table. You tried to insure my life for $2 million. Naming yourself sole beneficiary. 11 days after my diagnosis. I let the paper sit between us, its institutional letterhead glowing under the chandelier. The only reason you failed is that the tumor made me uninsurable. Not because you had a change of heart. Garrett's head dropped. Tears had begun to fall, landing silently on the white tablecloth, dark spots spreading like ink on paper. But I was conducting this movement toward its final crescendo, and I would not stop until every note had been played. I pulled out the final document, a printed screenshot of the text message chain between Garrett and the individual Roland had identified as V. I read it aloud, my voice carrying the cold precision of a narrator who has already decided the ending. The old man will not last. The estate will cover everything within the quarter. Just give me until February. I set the paper down beside the insurance rejection. You were not just gambling with my money, Garrett. You were scheduling my death. You converted my remaining lifespan into a payment deadline, a variable in your debt equation. You told your loan shark that my corpse would cover his losses. Garrett was sobbing, now ugly. Wretched sounds that produced no sympathy in me. Meredith had pushed her chair back from the table, her body angled toward the hallway as if preparing for flight. "Dad," Garrett choked, his face buried in his hands. "I am so sorry. You have to understand the pressure. I was drowning." "You were not drowning," I said. "You were swimming in my blood and calling it water." I closed the laptop. The screen went dark, leaving the room in the warm amber glow of the chandelier, a beautiful light illuminating ugly truth. But I was not finished. The evidence was the prosecution. What came next was the eulogy. And for that, I needed an instrument that my son believed was destroyed 3 weeks ago, melted down for the price of another losing bet. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew my phone. The screen glowed briefly in my palm, a single message thread open, a single word typed and waiting to be sent. I looked at my son across the table, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders convulsing with sobs that produced no mercy in me, and I pressed send. The word was simply, now. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The dining room existed in a vacuum of anticipation, the chandelier light perfectly still, the wine glasses catching amber refractions, the ruined dinner cooling between us like a battlefield going quiet. Then, from the adjacent room, separated from us by nothing more than a thin wall and a closed oak door, a sound emerged, that made the air in the room change its molecular composition. The Stradivarius. Vivian Stradivarius. 300 years of Cremonese craftsmanship. 30 years of my wife's fingerprints soaked into the varnish, producing a sound so deep, so achingly human, that it seemed to rise not from strings and wood, but from somewhere beneath the floor of the world itself. The first note was a low C sustained, resonant, vibrating through the walls with a physical presence that I felt in my healing skull and my restored eyes and the very marrow of my bones. Nikolai Petrov began to play Lullaby for my little conductor. Vivian had composed it the night Garrett was born. September 14th, 1985, writing the melody in pencil on the back of a hospital discharge form, while I held our newborn son in the chair beside her bed. She told me later that the notes came fully formed, as if the music had been waiting inside her for 9 months alongside the child. It was a simple piece, a gentle rocking rhythm, in 6 to 8 time, the melody moving stepwise through a minor key, before resolving into major on the final phrase. She played it for him every night, until he was 5 years old, the Stradivarius singing him to sleep in the amber glow of his bedroom lamp. Garrett's head snapped up from his hands, his face tear-streaked, swollen, the color of ashes transformed into something I had never seen before. Pure, unprocessed recognition. His mouth opened, but no words came. His body went rigid, every muscle locking as the melody reached the second phrase, the part where Vivian would always slow the tempo slightly, leaning into the sustained B-flat that she called the breathing note. "That is," Garrett whispered, his voice barely audible above the cello's resonance. "That is Mom's." "Yes," I said. "It is." The melody continued through the wall, each note arriving with the clarity of a memory being physically reconstructed in the air. I watched my son's face crumble in stages. First the recognition, then the confusion, then the dawning horror of understanding. He had sold this instrument. He had watched it leave in a case carried by a stranger. He had believed it was gone forever, absorbed into a collector's vault. Or worse, dismantled for parts by someone who saw only wood and varnish, where a soul had once lived. "How?" he gasped. "I sold it. Crane had it. It was gone." "You sold your mother's voice for $1.9 million, I said, my own voice steady despite the emotion pressing behind my sternum. "And a man you have never met, a man I discovered playing violin in a Moscow subway station 25 years ago, flew from Vienna to New York, and paid $2.1 million of his own money to bring her home, because he understood what you did not, that some instruments carry souls, and souls are not for sale." The lullaby reached its bridge, the passage where Vivian would always add a slight rubato, stretching time like taffy, making the music breathe the way a sleeping child breathes. Nikolai played it with the same tenderness, as if Vivian herself were guiding his bow from somewhere beyond the walls of this room. Garrett slid from his chair. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a man performing grief, but slowly, as if his bones had simply surrendered their structural integrity. He sank to the floor beside the dining table, his back against the chair leg, his face turned toward the wall from which the music emanated. He was listening to his mother sing to him for the first time in 34 years, and the recognition was destroying him more completely than any bank statement or surveillance footage ever could. I stood and reached into my satchel one final time. I withdrew the velvet box, small, navy blue, worn at the corners, and placed it on the tablecloth, between the cold ham and the laptop's dark screen. "Open it," I said. Garrett looked up from the floor, his hands trembling so violently he could barely grasp the box. He fumbled with the brass clasp. The lid opened. Inside, resting on white silk, was Vivian's conductor's baton ebony shaft, silver ferrule, treble clef engraving catching the chandelier light like a tiny star. "She gave me that on our 30th anniversary, I said. "Nikolai found it at a dealer on Antique Row. You had sold it for $200. I let that number hang in the air, $200 for 30 years of marriage, for every performance she attended, for every time she stood in the wings and whispered bravo as I walked off stage." But the baton was not all he recovered. I opened my phone and read from the list, Roland and I had compiled. Your mother's practice, oboe, the one from the Vienna flea market, sold to Callahan's for $800. I recovered it for $1,200. Her manuscript collection, 47 original compositions in her handwriting, sold as a lot for $11,000. Recovered for $14,000 from a private collector in Princeton who described them as, and I quote, clearly stolen family documents that should never have left the home. Your grandmother's pearl brooch, $400 at a consignment shop on Pine Street, recovered for $600. The lullaby was fading now. Nikolai drawing the final phrase out with a diminuendo so gradual it felt like watching a sunset dissolve into the horizon line. The last note hung in the air for what felt like an eternity before finally releasing into silence. I looked down at my son on the floor, a crumpled figure surrounded by the wreckage of a dinner he had funded with my blindness and his mother's memory. Meredith was standing now, frozen by the kitchen doorway, her face a mask of something that might have been shock, or might have been the rapid calculation of a woman realizing her lifeboat had just sunk. Your mother wrote that lullaby the night you were born, Garrett, I said, my voice finally carrying the weight of every emotion I had suppressed for 8 weeks. She played it every evening until you were 5. She called it her conversation with the future, a message to the man she hoped you would become. And you sold the instrument that carried her soul for the price of a losing bet on a video game tournament. I buttoned my jacket with steady fingers. I am no longer your father, Garrett. I am your audience. And tonight, your performance was nothing short of a disgrace. The sound of Garrett's sobbing filled the room like a broken instrument trying to play a note. It no longer had the structural integrity to sustain. I stood above him, my charcoal jacket buttoned, my posture straight, my restored eyes, seeing every detail of his collapse with merciless clarity, and I felt nothing that resembled pity. Pity requires the belief that the suffering is undeserved. My son's suffering was an invoice he had written with his own hand. I reached into the leather satchel one final time and withdrew a white legal envelope. It was heavy-weighted with the kind of institutional authority that cannot be argued with or charmed away. I slid it across the tablecloth toward Garrett's empty chair, the paper whispering against the linen like a blade being drawn from its sheath. Inside that envelope, I said, my voice as level as a sustained pedal tone, you will find 4 documents. The first is a copy of the police report I filed 72 hours ago with the Philadelphia Police Department, Financial Crimes, and Elder Abuse Division. The charges are grand larceny and financial exploitation of an at-risk adult. Garrett looked up from the floor, his face a ruin of tears and mucus. His mouth moved, but I continued before he could form words. The second document is a civil lawsuit for $395,000. The original $295,000 you stole, plus the $100,000 in secondary costs I incurred to save my own life through alternative funding. The third is a temporary restraining order prohibiting you from contacting me, approaching my residence, or accessing any account bearing my name. I paused, allowing each document to land with its full weight before delivering the final blow. The fourth is an eviction notice. You have 48 hours to vacate this property. Garrett scrambled to his feet, his legs unsteady, his hand gripping the table edge for balance. You cannot evict me from my own house, he said, his voice cracking between desperation and disbelief. My name is on the mortgage. I have been paying. Your name is on nothing, I said quietly. This house was purchased through a limited liability corporation I established 8 years ago, when your first development firm collapsed and you needed a place to land. I was the silent owner. You were the tenant. And tenants who default on their humanity lose their lease. The blood drained from Garrett's face a second time, a fresh wave of shock layering over the devastation already there. He had believed this home was his achievement, his foundation, the physical proof that he had built something with his own hands. Learning that it had always been mine, that even the ground beneath his feet had been a gift he had never earned, was the final architectural collapse of every lie he had constructed. Meredith moved. It was not the movement of a wife reaching for her husband in his moment of destruction. It was the precise, efficient motion of a woman who had completed her calculations and determined the optimal exit vector. She stepped away from the kitchen doorway, her heels clicking against the hardwood with the cold rhythm of a metronome set to allegro, and stopped directly in front of Garrett. "I am not going to prison for your addiction, Garrett," she said, her voice carrying not a single note of compassion or solidarity. It was the voice of a business partner terminating a contract, clean, final, utterly devoid of sentiment. "We are done." She unclasped the gold Rolex from her wrist. The watch I had seen her admire on surveillance footage, purchased with my stolen funds, and dropped it onto the dining table. The metallic clink of gold striking mahogany sounded like a period at the end of their marriage. She did not look at Garrett as he reached toward her. She simply turned and walked toward the bedroom, her footsteps receding down the hallway with the mechanical precision of a woman who had already packed the suitcase in her mind. Garrett stood alone in the middle of the dining room, abandoned by his wife, exposed by his father, surrounded by the cooling remains of a Christmas dinner that had become his last supper in this house. His knees buckled, and he sank into the nearest chair, his face dropping into his hands. "Dad," he whispered. "Please. I have nothing left." I pulled on my winter coat, the heavy wool, settling over my shoulders like armor. "You had everything, Garrett. A father who trusted you with his life. A mother's legacy, worth millions. A home you did not earn, but were given freely. And you converted it all into pixels on a screen. That is not my failure. That is yours." I walked toward the front door. The hallway felt longer than I remembered, each step carrying me further from the man I had raised and closer to the silence I had chosen. Behind me, Garrett's voice followed like a dying echo. "Please, Dad. It is Christmas." I did not turn around. The front door opened onto a world transformed by snowfall. The December night was pristine white powder covering the lawn, the hedges, the rooftops of Bryn Mawr in a blanket of clean silence. My breath formed small clouds in the cold air, disappearing into the dark with each exhalation. The Christmas lights on the neighboring houses reflected off the fresh snow in patterns of red and gold, a celebration I was no longer part of and no longer wished to be. As I reached my car, the side door of the house opened. Meredith emerged, dragging 2 large suitcases, her heels slipping slightly on the icy pavement. She saw me and slowed, her eyes darting back toward the house to ensure Garrett was not watching. "Thane Edmund," she corrected herself, her voice low and hurried. "Wait. I have something you will want. A recording from last month. Garrett talking to his bookie, admitting he hoped you would pass quietly so the estate would clear his debts. Full audio. Unedited. I will give it to you if you keep my name out of the civil suit." I looked at her, this woman who had encouraged my son's spending, who had asked about my life insurance over studio microphones, who had treated my impending blindness as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a tragedy to be mourned. And I saw the same predatory calculation that had ruined Garrett. She was not offering evidence out of remorse. She was trading it for immunity. "Put it in my mailbox," I said, my voice as cold as the ice beneath my boots. "I will decide what it is worth." I climbed into my car. The engine turned over with a steady, reliable hum, the sound of a machine that does what it is designed to do, without complaint or deception. I sat for a moment, my hands on the wheel, watching the house through the windshield. The lights were still on the garrison facade, glowing brilliantly against the dark, but inside, the structure was hollow. I drove into the December night, the last notes of Vivian's lullaby still resonating somewhere behind me in that empty house. She wrote that melody for a boy who loved music. Tonight, it played as a eulogy for the man that boy became. The snow fell in perfect silence, and for the first time in 8 weeks, my heart was not the heaviest thing in the room. The marble floors of the Philadelphia County Courthouse echoed with my footsteps on the morning of April 18th, 2025. The building smelled of wood polish and consequence, old oak paneling absorbing decades of verdicts and the silent prayers of men who had run out of lies. Spring sunlight poured through tall arched windows, casting rectangles of gold across the terrazzo floor, and I walked through them with the measured stride of a man who had earned every step. My attorney, Christopher Ward, walked beside me. "The plea was finalized 3 weeks ago," he said quietly. "Guilty. On both counts. Today is sentencing impact statements, judicial remarks, formal record. We entered courtroom 4B. Dark wood paneling, pew-like benches, dust motes, drifting in angled columns of light. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle sat Garrett, hunched in a borrowed suit, cheap polyester with limp lapels, his public defender flipping through notes without confidence. Garrett did not look at me. He stared at the table, hands clasped, white-knuckled. All rise. The Honorable Judge Patricia Holloway presiding. Judge Holloway entered late 50s, silver hair in a severe arrangement, reading glasses perched on her nose. She opened the case file. We are here for sentencing in the matter of People versus Garrett Allen Harg. B.S. Ward, I understand the victim wishes to present an impact statement. I rose, carrying a single piece of yellowed paper. A child's careful handwriting on elementary school stationery. I placed it on the podium and looked at Garrett, who had finally raised Vivian's dark eyes to mine. Your Honor, my name is Edmund Hargrove. I am 72 years old. I spent 30 years as principal conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and I am the father of that man. I held up the paper. This is an essay my son wrote at age 10. A school assignment called The Person I Admire Most. I read aloud. My dad makes music fly. He stands in front of 100 people, and they all listen to him because he knows how to make beautiful sounds come out of their instruments. When I grow up, I want to make him proud. He says if you work hard and treat people with respect, you can achieve anything. My dad is the person I admire most because he never gives up, even when the music is really hard. I lowered the paper. Garrett's face was wet with silent tears. I do not know when that boy disappeared. But the man at that table is not the son who wrote those words. He did not just steal $395,000. He sold his mother's Stradivarius for gambling money. He stole my sight, or tried to. He scheduled my death as a payment deadline for his bookie. I did not lose money, Your Honor. I lost faith in the one person I should never have had to doubt. I returned to my seat. Christopher stood. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we request a brief musical performance. Nikolai Petrov, concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic, performing a composition by the victim's late wife on the instrument. The defendant sold illegally. Judge Holloway paused, looked at Garrett, then back. I will allow it. 2 minutes. The side door opened. Nikolai entered carrying the Stradivarius, sat beside the witness stand, drew the bow across the strings once, and began to play. Lullaby for My Little Conductor filled the courtroom. The gentle rocking rhythm Vivian had composed the night Garrett was born, stepwise motion through minor resolving to major, the breathing note on the sustained B-flat. 90 seconds that felt like a lifetime. The judge was motionless. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keys. Garrett sat with his head bowed, shoulders shaking in complete silence. The last note decayed into the wood-paneled walls. The silence that followed was sacred. Judge Holloway removed her glasses and looked at Garrett. Mr. Hargrove, stand. Garrett rose on trembling legs. In 22 years on this bench, I have sentenced thieves, fraudsters, and predators of every kind. But what you did exploiting your dying father, selling your dead mother's legacy, weaponizing a medical condition to gaslight the man who raised you, represents a depth of moral failure I find difficult to articulate within judicial constraints. Her gaze was unwavering. This court sentences you to 18 months Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, suspended contingent upon successful completion of 10 years supervised probation. Full restitution of $395,000 at 8% annual interest, payable at $3,500 monthly, 500 hours community service. 2 years mandatory inpatient gambling addiction treatment. Permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with your father. The gavel fell a sharp crack that rang through the courtroom like the final chord of a symphony that should never have been written. The bailiff moved toward Garrett. Sir, you need to come with me. Garrett turned. Dad, please, his voice broke. I am so sorry. The bailiff's hand closed on his shoulder, and my son disappeared through a side door into the machinery of consequence. I sat motionless, watching the door close, his footsteps fading into institutional silence. I gathered my coat, tucked Vivian's baton case into my satchel, and stepped into April sunlight. The warmth hit my face like a benediction. I could see trees budding along the courthouse steps, green leaves unfurling against blue sky with edges so sharp they looked painted. I could read every street sign. I could watch the world moving forward with perfect, restored clarity. My son had tried to steal that from me. He failed. The Pacific does not care about your family name or your criminal record. It does not ask whether you were a good father or a failed one. It simply plays its endless score against the rocks, the same ancient rhythm it has been performing for millions of years, making my son's betrayal feel like nothing more than a single wrong note in an infinite symphony. I moved to Carmel by the Sea in the high heat of July, trading the gray-haunted streets of Philadelphia for a small cottage perched on a cliff above the ocean. The house was modest, whitewashed walls, terracotta roof tiles, windows that opened directly onto the sound of the surf. I chose it because it faced west, toward the sunset, toward the horizon where the sky met the water in a line so clean it looked like the final bar of a composition resolving into silence. And because it was 3,000 miles from the man who once called me Dad. The Stradivarius stands on a custom stand in my living room, positioned near the window where the afternoon light catches the varnish and transforms it into liquid amber. I do not play it. I have never been a cellist, but its presence fills the room with the ghost of Vivian's music, a resonance that lives in the wood even when no bow touches the strings. Some mornings I sit with my coffee and simply look at it, watching the light move across its curves, and I hear her, not with my ears, but with the part of my memory that refuses to let her go. I established a new routine with the precision I once used to prepare concert seasons. My mornings begin with a walk along the coastal trail, 2 miles of cypress-lined path, where the salt air fills my lungs and the fog burns off by 9. I can see everything now. The edges of the world are sharp and permanent. Every wildflower along the trail, every hawk circling above the bluffs, every whitecap on the distant swells, all of it visible, all of it mine. I guard this site the way a recovered man guards his sobriety, with daily gratitude and the quiet understanding that it was nearly taken from me by someone who should have protected it. 3 afternoons a week, I volunteer at the Carmel Youth Music Center, a small community program housed in a converted chapel near the mission. I teach children how to hold a bow, how to read a staff, how to listen for the spaces between notes where the real music lives. Last Tuesday, a girl of 9 placed her small hands on a half-sized cello for the first time, and when she drew the bow across the open C string, the sound that emerged raw, untrained, but pure, made my throat close, with an emotion I had not allowed myself to feel in months. It was not grief. It was recognition. Vivian had sounded exactly like that once, in a practice room at Juilliard, before time and talent transformed her into something extraordinary. Gentle hands, I told the girl, adjusting her bow grip. Steady bow. Let the instrument breathe. She looked up at me with the unguarded trust that children extend to adults who have not yet disappointed them, and I thought, this is what teaching should always have been. Not the pressure of professional excellence, not the crushing weight of legacy and expectation, but the simple act of showing someone that music is safe, and that it will always be there when everything else fails. I believe God allowed this trial so I would finally understand that grace is not the absence of suffering but the presence of purpose within it. I do not say this lightly. I say it as a man who spent 8 weeks going blind while his own son counted the days until the darkness became permanent. I say it as a man who woke from surgery alone in a hospital room and found that the strangers around his bed cared more for his survival than his own blood. And I say it as a man who now sits in golden California light, alive, sighted, and at peace not because the wound has healed, but because God gave me the clarity to build a life on the other side of it. Last month, a thick envelope arrived from the Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution. I recognized the institutional postmark, The cheap paper, the careful block lettering of my son's handwriting on the address label. I carried it to my desk, weighed it in my hand for a moment, sensing the excuses, the pleas, the desperate apologies written inside, and then I fed it into the shredder without opening the seal. The machine ate his words with a mechanical whisper, converting his remorse into confetti that I emptied into the recycling bin. I am not his fuel source anymore. He must find his own way back to the light. But I am not entirely without mercy. 3 months ago, I asked Roland to establish an anonymous fund, routed through 2 intermediary trusts, that provides financial support to the gambling addiction counseling program at the facility where Garrett is completing his mandatory treatment. It is not forgiveness. It is not reconciliation. It is the act of an engineer who knows that a broken instrument can sometimes be repaired if the right tools are applied by someone other than the person who broke it. I will never tell him. I will never visit. But I will ensure that the resources exist for him to rebuild himself, if he chooses to. The choice is his. It was always his. I believe that God places us in seasons of loss, so that we might learn what truly deserves to be held. And I believe that love without boundaries is not love at all. It is permission dressed in tenderness, and it will destroy both the giver and the receiver if left unchecked. My silence is not punishment. It is the boundary I should have drawn years ago, the one that might have saved us both if I had possessed the courage to draw it sooner. If you have walked with me through this story, I thank you. If it touched something in you, a recognition, a warning, a permission to protect yourself from someone you love, then it has served its purpose. Share your thoughts below. Tell me what you would have done. And if this story moved you, consider subscribing so you will not miss the ones that follow. A small note before you go. While this narrative touches on real themes of family conflict, addiction, and elder exploitation, certain elements were dramatized to deepen the storytelling experience. If this type of content is not for you, feel free to explore other stories that better match your interests. The ocean plays its endless score against the cliffs outside my window, and I close my eyes not because I cannot see, but because some melodies are better felt than watched. The lullaby is over, but the music, the real music, is finally mine again.